Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Tom Campbell. I'm the director of the Fine Art Museums, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon for the first of two lectures that we'll be holding now, one at 1 and one at 2:30 on Irving Penn. This is an especially enjoyable lecture to introduce because it's the subject of the lecture is a really significant gift to the Fine Art Museums. As I imagine everyone in this audience is aware, can we turn the music off? Up at the back, thank you. As I'm sure everyone here is aware, the big distinction between museums in America and museums in Europe is that so many of the great museums in Europe are the result of royal and ducal collections that came into government hands and now are available to the public. The contrast in America is that when the great museums of America were built in the late 19th and early 20th century, most of them had no art whatsoever, and they were dependent on the generosity of contemporary philanthropists to build their collections. And this is a kind of an ongoing, uniquely American experiment that has developed over the decades. And the reason our collections are as rich as they are is because of the generosity of generations of philanthropists. And I've come across few supporters as generous and as constant as Bernard and Barbro Osher. As I've gotten to know them since I came to San Francisco 5.5 years ago, I've come to realize how their steadfast support for the Fine Art Museums is part of their larger commitment to the arts and culture of the San Francisco landscape. And today we're actually gathered in a building that Bernard and Barbro helped the city to build in the early 2000s. So it's very appropriate that now we're here to celebrate the ensuing gift of their collection, which is currently on display up on the second floor, American Beauty, the Osher Collection of American Art. Scrupulously assembled with great passion and knowledge over 6 decades, the Osher's promised gift to the Fine Art Museums comprises 61 masterworks of American art by 39 artists, several of whom are not currently represented in our collection. True to Barney and Barbro's unwavering dedication to cultural accessibility and the artistic enrichment of the Bay Area, their promised gift will significantly expand the story we tell our audiences about the rich artistic heritage of the United States. And these collections will now be seen by the hundreds of thousands of visitors who come to the de Young each year. Fun fact, last year the Fine Art Museums were the 6th most visited art museum in the United States. We should really feel good about that. I'm also representing the gratitude of our mayor, Mayor Breed, who cannot be here today, but who has, by this document, a proclamation, declared that this is the Bernard and Barbro Osher Day in San Francisco. And it's a fabulous proclamation recognizing Barney and Barbro's generosity with all sorts of clauses, whereas this and whereas that. So, Bernard and Barbro, I'll give this to you. You can peruse it at your leisure at home. Our lecturer this afternoon is Lauren Palmor, who has worked in great dedication over several years to catalogue and to create a really beautiful publication on this collection. And to introduce her, I'm going to ask Timothy Anglin-Burghardt, the head of our American department and our distinguished senior curator, who has also played a close friend of Barney and Barbro's, and has also played a very important part in bringing this collection and cataloguing this collection for the Fine Art Museums. Tim has has had an extraordinary career here. He has curated or co-hosted something like 50 exhibitions and authored or contributed to more than 20 publications. So no better person to introduce Lauren. And Tim, thank you for your critical work here as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and welcome everyone to the de Young Museum. It's my great pleasure and an honor to introduce Dr. Lauren Palmor, Associate Curator of American Art for the Fine Arts Museums. After distinguished work at other museums, Lauren joined the Fine Arts Museum specifically to research the Osher collection, exhibition, and catalog, funded by an Osher grant. So once again, we are deeply indebted to Barbro and Bernard for their generous philanthropy. Lauren served most recently as the coordinating curator for the San Francisco presentations of the traveling exhibitions Alice Neel, People Come First, in 2022, and Ansel Adams, In Our Time, in 2023. She's also the author of the book Bouquets of Art, a flower dictionary from the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, which will be featured prominently during our annual Bouquets to Art event in the first week of June. Most relevantly, she is the brilliant curator and distinguished author of American Beauty, the Osher Collection of American Art, projects that she has realized with her typical passion and perception. So please join me in welcoming Lauren Palmor.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. It means a great deal to me to share this exhibition and catalog with the world after so many years of effort and care. Today, I want to offer you both a lecture and an invitation. And this is an invitation to join me in celebrating the promised gift of the Osher Collection of American Art to the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. As you've heard, this promised gift marks one of the most transformative moments in our museum's history. Bernard and Barbro have long been a cornerstone of support for the Fine Arts Museums and for the city's larger cultural landscape. Formed over the course of 6 decades, this collection includes paintings, drawings, and sculptures that all attest to the power and poetry of American art. The collection reveals the various ways in which American art has been shaped by international influences. Many of the works represent themes of transatlantic exchange and American artistic communities, both at home and abroad. Historically broad and aesthetically significant, the Osher collection features many of the United States' foremost masters and reflects an array of responses to an exceptionally dynamic period in American art and American history from 1848 to 1960. Here you can see the first and last chronological works in the collection, a marble bust by Hiram Powers, and a playful self-portrait by Jack Levine. We're commemorating this promised gift with a stunning exhibition upstairs, which I hope you've all visited, and if you haven't, please go upstairs after my talk. We also are celebrating the publication of the accompanying book, A Labor of Love that has unfolded over the past 9 years. This promised gift benefits our local, national, and international visitors and mirrors the ideals of the Bernard Osher Foundation, which seeks to improve quality of life through support for higher education and the arts. Reflecting a multiplicity of voices and perspectives, the Osher Collection will serve as a resource for research, education, and public programs like today's talk, fostering a deeper appreciation of American art and the vast evolving landscape of American experiences. So today's presentation has 2 parts. I'm going to open with a very broad overview of the major themes in the collection, and the second half of my talk will consist of an exploration of a few key works, and I'm going to share fun stories and context. Of course, the collection is vast, and I could talk here all day, but I think Jeff would kick me off stage. So I've narrowed down the selection to a few favorites, but I'll begin with just the larger context for my talk. D.H. Lawrence wrote, "Every continent has its own spirit of place." That works from the Osher collection exemplify this sentiment, and they reflect the rich variety of sites where American artists gathered in search of this spirit, both at home and abroad. At the beginning of the 19th century, American art reflected the aims and values of a young democracy that was proud of its flowering aims. Artists captured the spirit of the age using a visual language that reflected these democratic ideals. For example, an artist like John Lewis Krimmel infused his work with this patriotic spirit that reflected the cultural and social mood of his time. As the century progressed, wealthy Americans enjoyed increasingly accessible opportunities to travel abroad, influencing the visual and material culture of the United States. For example, Thomas Cole's trips to Italy in the early 1830s and 1840s impacted the development of American art through the introduction of European landscape traditions that he transmitted through his romantic and spiritual paintings. In the later decades of the 19th century, travel to Europe, especially to Paris, was considered essential for aspiring artists. In all, over 2,000 American painters born before 1880 are documented as having spent time in the French capital. In the academies and ateliers of European art centers that also included Florence and Munich, Dusseldorf, and Rome, a young American could receive training that was then thought to be superior to what was available at home. One such artist was Cecilia Beaux, who left her native Philadelphia for Paris in January 1888. She enrolled at the Académie Julienne. The previous year, she had drawn critical acclaim at the 1887 Paris Salon for her painting The Last Days of Infancy, a contemplative double portrait of her sister and her son. Buoyed by her international success, Beaux decided to continue her studies abroad. As one of the few art schools that accepted women, the Académie Julienne drew female students from all over Europe and the United States. They were expected to execute drawings in charcoal, and this drawing, which is hanging upstairs, demonstrates Beau's direct approach to the figure. Rendered from slightly below, it replaces the usual rigidity of an academic study with empathy and intimacy. Although Beaux expressed disappointment with her formal training in Paris, this time in her life had a significant impact. Viewed as a whole, her student works show a young artist pushing towards greatness, and by the end of her time abroad, her instructor, Rodolphe Julien, called her a true artist. John Singer Sargent was born in Florence to two American expatriates, and he grew up on an extended grand tour of European art capitals and resorts. In 1874, he entered the Paris atelier of Carolus Duran, and there he found a studio filled with students from various countries. They bonded over their work and their shared responsibilities, which included paying studio rent and hiring their own models. These young artists also posed for each other, painting for practice and pleasure. They embraced the tradition of exchanging these portraits and other student work, marking the personal and professional connections between the young artists of Paris. At the left, you see a sketch by James Carroll Beckwith, who drew Sargent at his easel in the studio, offering an observation of his friend's brilliant working methods. And on the right, you see a portrait from the Osher collection, a likeness of his friend and classmate, the artist Eugène Juillerat. He inscribed it at the top, "À mon ami," to my friend. In the fall of 1872, after establishing a studio in St. Louis, William Merritt Chase drew the attraction of a group of patrons who offered to send him to Europe for travel and study. In return, Chase would act as their buying agent abroad, and he would paint a picture for each of them at the end of his studies. It is said in response to this offer, Chase famously exclaimed, "My God, I would rather go to Europe than to heaven." When he enrolled at the Academy of Fine Arts in Munich, he was in good company. Between 1870 and 1885, around 300 American artists were known to have studied and worked in the Bavarian capital. This portrait from the Osher collection, painted shortly after his return to the United States, demonstrates his Munich style, with its limited palette and expressive handling of paint. In the last decades of the 19th century, American artists felt particularly drawn to Italy, with many gravitating towards Venice. The year 1880 was the apex of the American presence in the city, and the American artists thrived in this vibrant artistic community, inspiring one another and feeling collectively captivated by the scenery. Thomas Moran made the first of multiple visits to Venice in 1886, later producing Sunset Santa Maria and the Ducal Palace, Venice, a poetically transcribed view painted in an iridescent palette. Capturing the city's architectural grandeur, Moran heightens the dramatic impact of the scene through his exquisite play of light and the architecture's shimmering reflections on the water. This sparkling style echoes J.M.W. Turner's earlier influential views of the city, which we see in comparison on the right. While several Osher collection highlights attest to the American presence in European cities, other works in the collection describe the experiences of artists who traveled even farther afield, finding inspiration in less accessible places like Japan, Middle East, and Mexico. I'm going to speak about Albert Herder's time in Japan a little bit later, so for now I will begin with Sargent's travels in the Middle East. As Sargent ventured beyond the art capitals of Europe, his practice led him to the Middle East, where he was conducting research for his mural cycle, The Triumph of Religion, which you can see at the Boston Public Library. Sargent was likely traveling through Syria or the Jordan Valley when he encountered tribes of nomadic Bedouin people, an experience he recorded in this striking portrait. This compelling likeness was drawn and painted simultaneously with a loaded brush, and this portrait is one of only a few Sargent oils with a Bedouin theme, a subject he's better known for for his time in working in watercolors. In Cuernavaca, Mexico, Moran found inspiration in a landscape that provided him with rich materials for his sketchbooks. He was struck by the city's lush and striking architecture, lush setting and striking architecture, which led him to describe Mexico in a style that dramatically departed from his more dramatic images of Venice and the American West. Lighter in touch and softer in their effect, Moran's picturesque Cuernavaca paintings, such as Near Cuernavaca, recall the natural effects painted by Corot and the Barbizon School. Here, a group of women gather near a flowing fountain, each bearing vessels for carrying water. In the background, the city rises like a brilliant vision framed by time-worn trees. That Moran painted this canvas a few years after his 1903 departure suggests that the city occupied his imagination long after his departure. Such international experiences prove transformative, not only for the travelers themselves, but also for those who benefited from these experiences indirectly. Equipped with newfound skills and insights, many artists return to the United States as cultural emissaries and sometimes teachers, infusing the burgeoning artistic landscape with the resonances of European training. Artists who traveled abroad ultimately played a pivotal role in the development of American art. For example, in 1896, William Merritt Chase founded the Chase School of Art, now Parsons School of Design, in order to impart his techniques and philosophies to a younger generation. Such contributions underscore the enduring impact of European academic influences on the evolution of American art education. Frank Vincent Dumont traveled to Paris in 1888, enrolling at the Académie Julian. Upon his return to New York City, he took a teaching position at the Art Students League, where he taught for more than 50 years. He's best remembered as a teacher who helped shape generations of young artists, teaching them technical skills and playing a pivotal role in influencing his students to broaden their cultural horizons. In 1893, Dumont designed a study abroad program that may have been the first such travel program designed specifically for American art students. He brought his first group to the medieval French village of Crécy-en-Brie, where he painted this full-length portrait 1 year prior. The impact of these European influences resonated far beyond the academies and ateliers of the East Coast. For example, the Osher collection features the work of artists who adapted French Impressionist techniques to painting life on the West Coast. For instance, Child Hassam's studies in Paris led him to absorb the Impressionist style, and he adopted a vivid, lightened palette like we can see demonstrated in the painting on the left. He went on to hold an Impressionist brush up to his images of American life, and he painted on the porch during a productive visit to Portland, Oregon. His paintings from this visit mark a fusion of European styles with the light and flora of the Pacific Northwest, enriching the broader history of how Impressionism was disseminated throughout the United States. Richard E. Miller belonged to a younger generation of Giverny Luminists who worked in a mode described as decorative Impressionism. Miller painted his Portrait of a Young Girl by a Red Lacquered Stand, or, more charmingly, Princess in the Land of Sunshine, in Pasadena, California, transposing the imprint of French Impressionism and its light-suffused palette to the West Coast. Working at the estate of Eva Scott Feniers, a wealthy student, Miller used French Impressionist techniques to describe the appearance of a Pasadena garden, which resembled the luminous paradise he had previously found in Giverny. In addition to traveling abroad and studying in major European art centers, American art also benefited from the proliferation of artistic gathering places that began to take hold across the United States. Looking to work at home rather than abroad, artists increasingly gathered in scenic rural settings in search of inspiration and community. A varied and vibrant landscape of creative enclaves emerged, both international and domestic, wherein American artists found their voices and visions while working side by side. Locations such as Gloucester, Massachusetts, and Santa Fe, New Mexico became laboratories for the development and integration of a wide variety of ideas that American artists brought back from their experiences abroad, overall contributing to the formation of a distinct American artistic outlook. For example, John Sloan benefited greatly from periods that he spent in both Gloucester and Santa Fe, and these locations played critical roles in his career, offering him seasonal retreats that diversified his artistic subjects and allowed him to experiment with color and composition. The Osher collection includes multiple views of Gloucester, an important summer art colony with a long history. Located on Cape Ann, Gloucester has attracted generations of artists seeking inspiration in the area's natural beauty and active harbor. By 1890, artist Helen Knowlton described Gloucester as the Brittany of America, a designation bolstered by the legion of Gloucester pictures found throughout the history of American art. The Osher collection features two very different views of this artistic enclave. Hassam's Early Morning Inner Harbor Gloucester looks inward to document the variety of activities surrounding the working harbor. John Sloan's meditative Somber Coast, Gloucester, Massachusetts, looks outward toward the Atlantic and what the artist described as the long, straight edge of the ocean. Artists in pursuit of enchanting Western landscapes could travel to New Mexico, a region so remote that visitors felt like they discovered a new world in the region's creative enclaves. In the early decades of the 20th century, the area's artistic presence grew dramatically as artists ventured to Santa Fe and Taos, seeking inspiration in the grandeur of the Southwest. This rapid growth led to the establishment of formal schools and institutions, such as the Taos Society of Artists and the New Mexico Museum of Art. A number of Osher collection artists were drawn to these areas in the 1910s and 1920s. Robert Henry first visited Santa Fe in 1916, and he played an active role in attracting other American artists to the area. His arresting portrait, Ricardo of San Ildefonso, is one of the nearly 100 portraits that Henry painted that summer. The painting depicts Richard Martinez, a young boy from the San Ildefonso Pueblo who later became a well-known artist recognized for his achievements in painting and pottery. The painting is a notable example of Henry's influential sensitivity toward young subjects. In his influential book, The Art Spirit, Henry urged aspiring artists to feel the dignity of a child. Do not feel superior, for you are not. Henry had painted Ricardo earlier in that same summer, seen here in the portrait on the right. Later, critic Dorothy Grafley noted that Henry's sitters grew more intensely human as his experiences with them deepened. And Ricardo's second portrait, from the Osher collection, the one on the left, seems to reveal more of his emotional state, a feeling that may have emerged after the artist and sitter had spent more time together. Georgia O'Keeffe made her first extended trip to New Mexico in the summer of 1929, staying at the Taos compound of the arts patron Mabel Dodge Lewin. Immediately, O'Keeffe knew that she had found her great subject, writing, "When I got to New Mexico, that was mine. As soon as I saw it, that was my country." O'Keeffe's ardor for the region is unmistakable in one of her greatest early New Mexico series, composed of about 8 pictures depicting San Francisco de Asís, better known as Rancho's Church. front of Rancho's church frames the old Spanish church between the forces of the sky and the earth, foregrounding the atmospheric tension that underpins some of her most successful and arresting New Mexico pictures. This painting is the sole frontal view of the church from the series and a departure from her fragmentary images of the same subject. She wrote, quote, "Most artists who have spent any time in Taos have to paint it, I suppose, just as they have to paint a self-portrait. I had to paint it, the back of it several times, the front once." And that one painting is hanging upstairs. From Gloucester Harbor to the New Mexico desert, the Osher collection illustrates the range of sites where creative communities flourish domestically. Here are two more examples representing the significance of the Adirondacks and Connecticut as places of artistic convergence and respite. Though the Survey of American Art Centers presented by the collection is not comprehensive, it is geographically diverse, demonstrating the varied settings where American artists have historically traveled to engage with the landscape and each other, and connecting the legacy of international influences to the development of uniquely American artistic perspectives. Crucibles for artistic production, these sites nurtured generations of artists and influenced the course of American art history. As a group, the Osher collection illustrates how American artists have long sought to define and declare American subjects and styles, and these works affirm and interrogate how a distinctly national art was shaped by its international influences and its regional character. So I'm going to move on from this very broad overview to focus on a selection of collection highlights. While researching and writing the catalog, I encountered many fascinating stories and points of connection, and I'd like to share just a few of my favorites with you today. There are over 60 works in the collection, and I could share captivating details with you about any of them. And for today's presentation, I chose 8 works to highlight, and I hope you enjoy learning more about these artists and their worlds. I also invite you to pick up a copy of the catalog from the museum stores and learn even more of the riveting stories behind this collection. I'm going to begin with Stringing Onions by John Singer Sargent, which already seems to be a visitor favorite. In the summer of 1878, Sargent was seeking new subjects and ideas for his paintings. After an unproductive week in Naples, Sargent departed for the island of Capri in search of better working conditions, and he traveled there on a market boat packed with fruits and vegetables. He was looking for artistic inspiration, which came almost immediately, thanks to the island's vernacular architecture and the attractive traditional clothing worn by the Caprese women. Word of Sargent's arrival quickly spread around the island, reaching the English artist Frank Hyde, whose spacious studio was located in the convent of Santa Teresa overlooking the Bay of Naples. Hyde generously invited Sargent to come share his studio, and he welcomed him into the island's small artistic community. Hyde also introduced Sargent to Rosina Ferrara, a popular local model. 17 years old, Ferrara was said to possess a striking beauty. She was renowned for her charm, her professionalism, her talent, and her ability to speak fluent French with visiting artists. Hyde described that when Sargent first saw Ferrara, he was so fascinated with her that he immediately made 3 studies in profile, including this portrait on the right, all of which he painted in Hyde's studio. Ferrara went on to model for most of Sargent's Capri works, and he was obviously transfixed. In Capri, he painted many more portraits of her and other scenes of daily life that incorporated his muse in the happenings on the picturesque island. The delicately executed Stringing Onions depicts 2 young Caprese women in a bare, sunlit interior. The austere capaciousness of the setting suggests that the scene may have been painted in the convent studio of Santa Teresa. This quiet scene features delicate passages of still life throughout, and onions are spread across the windowsill like polished pearls. The figures braid strands of onions, which would later be hung to preserve the vegetables throughout the winter. The young woman standing near the window appears to be Ferrara, with her dark complexion, wavy hair, and pink dress that echoes other Sargent pictures of the model. The girl seated on a low stool against the wall could possibly represent Ferrara's sister, who is said to have been equally beautiful. Her presence suggests the passing of tradition from one generation to the next, and she holds in her hands one particularly beautiful onion, which she cradles like a precious jewel. The low vantage, indirect light, and carefully designed realism of Sargent's composition shares an affinity with historical domestic meditations, such as Vermeer's The Milkmaid, which similarly describes a woman's daily labor as a tranquil and contemplative activity. The vitality and intimacy of Stringing Onions epitomizes Sargent's skills as an observer of daily life. During his stay in Capri, these talents were augmented by a real intimacy between the artist, his sitter, and the artistic community. This rapport is plainly evident in Sargent's painting, which affectionately commemorates his muse and her labor. Another American artist who was greatly impacted by travel in Italy was Robert Blum. In 1880, at the age of 23, he went to Venice and was forever changed. His fascination with the local architecture, geography, and culture engaged him for nearly a decade. Blum's description of Venice and its people encompassed its lagoon and hidden courtyards. He reveled in the sparkling waters and the gleaming light, and he engaged with the city's diverse community of international artists. Throughout this period, he depicted Venetian life in oil, pen, ink, watercolor, pastels, and prints, developing a style largely influenced by the local scenery and by his contact with other expatriate artists. Shortly after his arrival, Blum became reacquainted with Frank Duveneck, who had been one of his teachers in Cincinnati. Duveneck then had a devoted following of American painters, known as the Duveneck Boys, who worked together in Venice each summer. Blum joined the group and rented a room at the Casa Jankovic, where many of them were staying. Located in the Campo San Biagio, many of the windows faced south, offering a view over the lagoon and the busy passing promenade below, which the artists sketched from their windows. In the summer of 1880, the group befriended Whistler, who called on them at the Casa Jankovic. Whistler savored the views from these rooms, moving through the quarters of Duveneck's students to sketch the adjacent canal. The view from Blum's room was one of Whistler's favorite vantages, and this gave Blum the opportunity to observe his etching and pastel techniques firsthand. The two artists became friends, swimming and sketching together and meeting over coffee at the Café Florian. In this drawing, Blum has sketched Whistler, or Jimmy, as he looks out from his window. Whistler had an immediate and lasting impact on Blum's style, and he was likely inspired by Whistler's subtle, tonal, atmospheric works like Nocturne in Blue and Silver on the left. Whistler's influence is especially apparent in Blum's Venetian Gondoliers, with its atmospheric rendering of the tonal harmonies and experiments of color. This expansive scene is rendered from the middle of the lagoon, suggesting that the artist set up his canvas on the rear-facing seat of a gondola. Looking out over the water towards the distance, gondoliers steer their boats in an asymmetrical pattern across the dazzling water, moving smoothly beneath luminous daylight. The high horizon line intersects with the gondoliers' bodies as they lean forward with the physical effort of their task. Floating like musical notes against a staff, they're bracketed by two fields of heavenly blue, the cloudless sky and the gently moving water. The painting immerses the viewer in a unified blue luster, characterizing Venice as a place more heaven than earth. Like Sargent and Blum, the art of William Merritt Chase was shaped by his experiences studying and traveling in Europe, and he lived and studied in Munich for 6 years, from 1872 to 1878. Before his return, Chase knew that he wanted to establish a remarkable studio back in the United States, and it is said that this dream possessed him. He began collecting art, furniture, textiles, and antiques with this grand studio in mind. In 1877, on a break from his studies in Germany, Chase spent 9 months in Venice, where he purchased much of the material that would later be prominently featured in his New York studio. The antiquary shop, which he painted in the US, from sketches compiled in Venice, captures just such a scene. The arrangement of the vendors' furniture, textiles, metalwork, and paintings foreshadows the future design of Chase's own theatrical displays. In 1878, Chase settled in New York City to teach at the famous Art Students League. He rented space in the 10th Street studio building, soon moving into rooms that were originally designed to serve as grand exhibition galleries. There, he installed an astonishing array of objects, fascinating visitors and critics who marveled at his amazing collections. Chase created his own opulent bohemian paradise, and the studio became a material aspect of his reputation, which he used to actively market himself to his colleagues, patrons, and the public. By 1880, many fashionable Americans and Europeans collected antiques, especially during their international travels. Seeking out markets abroad that they perceived as exotic, Chase and his contemporaries amassed attractive materials drawn from distant corners of the globe. Spanish bric-a-brac shop depicts one of the likely sources for his astonishing collection, as well as a prototype for his elaborately decorated studio. Art historian M. Elizabeth Boone notes that Chase's scene resembles one of the many storefronts along El Rastro, Madrid's popular open-air flea market. During Chase's acquisitive visits to Spain, this is one of the places where he would have encountered dealers of antiques, furniture, and fine art. In the foreground of Chase's painting, a handsomely attired antiques dealer beckons the viewer to come inside. He holds a cigarette and gestures to a selection of artfully arranged ceramics, metalwork, textiles, furniture, and paintings on view. In the back room, a woman is bent over a tapestry loom. The painting features multiple references to Velázquez works that Chase studied in Spanish museums. At the right, a copy of Velázquez's portrait of the buffoon Calabacillas hangs for sale above a Chinese porcelain jar. The woman in the back room refers to Velázquez's Las Hilanderas, which the artist copied in 1881. Chase freely echoes Velázquez's spatial organization and his vigorous technique, reflected in his treatment of draperies and textiles. Both compositions are framed along their left edges by heavy drapery, resembling grand theater curtains, suggesting a similar interest in staging and performance. Spanish bric-a-brac shop also recalls the contemporary work of Mariano Fortuny, whose tapestry merchant also references Las Hilanderas in its description of a tapestry vendor's stall in a Tangier marketplace. This rich description of the textures, colors, and visual effects of antique objects illustrates not only Chase's fondness for beautiful objects, but also his desire to possess them. Like Chase, Albert Herder was a collector and an artist, two aspects of his practice that are both represented by his painting Woman Reading. Herder first visited Japan as a teenager, and he later married fellow art student Adele McGuinness, and the couple returned for an extended honeymoon in 1893. It was an exceptionally happy period for the couple, who spent 5 months living and working in Japan. The following year, they both exhibited their watercolors from their travels at the Art Institute of Chicago. And here you can see two examples, a watercolor by Albert on the left and one by Adele on the right. During their travels, the Herders amassed a large collection of Japanese prints, textiles, and other decorative arts. Upon their return to the United States, these collections were exhibited and widely published. Herder emphasized his interest in Japanese art and design in interviews, photographs, and articles about his home. And in April 1919, the first page of the magazine The House Beautiful featured a photograph of the Herder home with Japanese pillar prints hung above the staircase. On the right is an example of such a pillar print design. In her portrait of Herder, the acclaimed photographer Jessie Tarbach Spiels depicted the artist seated in a chair draped in Japanese silk. An arrangement of framed Japanese woodblock prints from his collection can be seen behind him. Woman Reading reveals the strong stylistic influence of these prints on Herder's work. The seater is seated upright in pure profile, positioned at the left side of the canvas, echoing the asymmetry found in some Japanese prints. This format also allowed Herder the space to display a group of unframed color ukiyo-e prints pinned to the wall along the right. The woman's dress appears to have been made from a repurposed Japanese kimono, and the kimono widths in the skirt are accentuated by their unusual seam detailing, while the skirt appears to have been arranged to avoid distracting folds in the fabric. There were precedents for the inclusion of Japanese prints in Herder's portrait. For example, there's Manet's portrait of Emile Zola, which prominently features a Japanese print of a wrestler by Utagawa Kuniyaki II, also pinned to the wall on the right side of the composition. There's also Van Gogh's portrait of his friend Julien-François Tanguy, which places the sitter against a background filled with some of the countless Japanese prints that the painter collected. Like many of Herder's portraits from the 1890s, this composition also suggests the influence of Whistler, who presented a similar profile portrait in his arrangement in gray and black No. 1, better known as Whistler's Mother. Like Whistler's somber tonal arrangement in gray and black, Woman Reading depicts a subdued symphony in sage green and French blue. Herder's achievements as a portraitist made him one of the most celebrated artists of his time, and thus a target for parody by art students who created cartoons to playfully tease the artistic giants of their era. James Montgomery Flagg's send-up of Herder's painting was titled How to Pose a Model by Albert Herter. Flagg's drawing poses the woman at a stiff, erect angle with her head held still by a daguerreau-type photographer's clamp. She reads a book held out at 90 degrees with a rigid geometric form describing her profile, her hands, and her angular skirt. Faux Chinese characters and an English language laundry list have replaced Herder's Japanese prints. Although Flagg's content is problematic, the existence of his parody of Herder's portrait attests to the acclaimed status of the original. Another acclaimed painting in the Osher collection that can now be enjoyed by the public again is George Bellows' transitional 1908 masterwork in Virginia. Early in his career, George Bellows enrolled at the New York School of Art, where he studied under William Merritt Chase, a figure who became a major influence. Chase encouraged Bellows to take on and embrace a fluid style of brushwork that he retained throughout his career. It was also in Chase's classroom that Bellows first encountered Emma Story, his future wife. He courted her for more than 5 years before she would finally agree to marry him in 1910. In the summer of 1908, in the middle of this protracted courtship, Bellows accepted the offer to teach for 6 weeks at the University of Virginia Summer School, held on the campus at UVA in Charlottesville. That summer proved exceptionally challenging. He was despondent without Emma, and he found it nearly impossible to paint in the sultry and oppressive southern heat. He left Charlottesville after those 6 weeks with very little to show for his efforts. He pocketed a few dollars after paying off his personal expenses, and he returned home with very little work of his own. One biographer concluded, all in all, those 6 weeks in the South were among the most miserable of his entire life. Nonetheless, Bellows produced one of his most significant and moving landscapes in Charlottesville. Painted in July of 1908, In Virginia depicts an afternoon on the verdant campus of the university. This is an atmospheric Arcadian landscape, the air heavy with humidity. Languid figures stroll and stand amid the shade of the trees, and at least one couple in the foreground appears to be courting over a low stone wall. Female figures appear to float across the lawn, mingling beneath a majestic canopy of ash and maple trees. The university was not fully coeducational until 1970, so this scene may depict a dance weekend at the school when women from area schools were invited to socialize with male UVA students. The composition's subject and style resemble the work of the early 18th century painter Jean-Antoine Watteau, who often depicted elegantly dressed men and women flirting beneath the trees in decorous outdoor settings. One contemporary critic even deemed Bellows a 20th century Watteau, a description that might feel at odds with his more famous paintings of boxers. The scene also recalls the influence of Whistler. There's a theme. Whistler and Chase have a very big presence in this collection. Whistler's influence was felt by Bellows and his fellow members of the group of realist painters known as the Ashcan School. In Virginia resembles a response to a work such as Whistler's Unfinished Cremorne Gardens No. 2, which similarly features elegant women in diaphanous dresses who appear to hover above the ground. They stroll and converse, floating below an abstracted canopy of trees. In some instances, Bellows' dresses are similarly painted so thinly that they take on a gauze-like effect. With its blend of lyricism and vigorousness, In Virginia exemplifies the kind of restless realism that Bellows would continue to master in works such as Excavation at Night, painted later that same year. Now recognized as a key transitional work, In Virginia is simultaneously expressive in its brushwork and restrained in its mood. Bellows' accomplishments as a dreamer in paint reached their fullest realization in 1924 with Summer Fantasy, a dazzling and wistful work that echoes the Arcadian loveliness of In Virginia, which he produced 16 years prior. Rich in symbolism and allegory, Summer Fantasy explores the circle of life and the shadows of time, all while the sun sets over a perfect summer's day. In Virginia features collegiate youth and promise, while Summer's Fantasy bears the marks of nostalgia and memory. Representing a little-known phase of Bellows' landscape painting, In Virginia bridges the influence of his artistic predecessors and the development of his own mature style. Although the artist is best known for his achievements as a staunch realist, In Virginia attests to his capacity for poetry and beauty. Frederick Carl Frieseke's The Kitchen Door similarly transports me to a beautiful, far-off place, and I'm delighted to introduce you to this painting by the renowned American Impressionist. The Kitchen Door exemplifies Frieseke's mastery of light and color, and this scene captures the leisurely and idyllic atmosphere of a summer day. As a last-generation Giverny painter, Frieseke remained in the French Impressionist colony longer than other Americans, staying in this picturesque village until 1918. Frieseke and his wife Sadie stayed at the home on the left, Le Hameau, a farmhouse adjacent to the home of Claude Monet. Le Hameau had its own garden that extended to the stream that had been diverted to flow through Monet's garden to feed his lily pond. Like Monet, Frieseke designed the garden to provide subjects for his paintings. Frieseke's wife Sadie, who is shown seated on the right, maintained the garden, and visitors described it as running riot with vibrant flowers and vines, including roses and foxgloves and passion vines. The walled garden served as Frieseke's outdoor studio, where he posed his models beneath the climbing plants, manicured trees, and lush flower beds that Sadie nurtured. Sadie also helped Frieseke bridge the well-known gulf between Monet and most of the American artistic community in Giverny. By all accounts, Monet and Sadie were both passionate gardeners. They enjoyed an easy relationship. Her niece later remembered Monet liked Sadie and wanted her to be the first to see a little bridge just completed. Several members of the Monet family joined us, and Sadie knew them all. Le Hameau was designed to harmonize with the landscape. Its exterior was painted lemon yellow, as were the living room walls. The kitchen was painted a deep French blue, and the doors that opened into the garden were emerald green. Inspiration for these bold colors may have come from Monet's home, which featured a similar palette, including a blue kitchen, that also unified his beloved gardens with his decorative displays and Japanese prints inside. Frieseke would have been particularly sensitive to such color relationships, as he painted by natural light both inside and outside the farmhouse. The kitchen door links the garden to the farmhouse interior. A woman wearing a kimono-style dress carries a basket of apples across the threshold from the resplendent garden into the darkened kitchen. Although Frieseke does not show the garden's stone walls, he manages to pictorially represent this space as a private retreat, free from the incursions of the modern world. The painting captures the luster and sparkle of the outdoors. The model is backlit by the renowned Giverny light that shines through the thin fabric of her dress. Frieseke plays with the light by employing broken brushwork and evoking the effects of dappled sunlight. He also borrowed techniques from Pierre-Auguste Renoir, who developed a practice of painting thinly over a clean white canvas with sparkling effects. Frieseke himself declared his preference for Renoir's work, and his attraction to figurative impressionism appears to owe a great deal to the French master. The summer dress worn by the model appears to be a contemporary tea gown adapted from kimono-inspired designs. With its low neckline and Japanese-influenced kosode sleeves, the dress looks like the type of garment that was then worn by women in artistic circles. Similar styles were promoted by avant-garde designers such as the couturier Paul Poiret, whose 1911 Blida dress had a similar deep neckline and loose waist. The kitchen door epitomizes how Frisiki drew inspiration for his figurative impressionism from his domestic environment. And we're going to travel forward in time. Of the many rediscoveries represented across the Osher collection, I'm perhaps most partial to this drawing by Yasuo Kuniyoshi, Boy Frightened by Lightning from 1921. Previously known to scholars only through gallery records and archival photographs, it was long considered an important missing work from Kuniyoshi's early period. I'm pleased to share that the work is now on public view for the first time in many decades. Kuniyoshi grew up in the city of Okayama in western Japan. At age 17, he came by himself to the United States, initially settling in Los Angeles. Seeking artistic training and professional opportunities, he moved to New York City, eventually finding the Progressive and Inclusive Art Students League in 1916. There, he would long be associated as a student and a teacher. He established transformative friendships at the League, including with classmate Catherine Schmidt, a young painter from New York City, whom he later married. Kuniyoshi's expanding social circle also grew to include Hamilton Easter Field, a wealthy writer and artist who became a friend and patron. Field was a collector of both American folk art and Japanese prints, and he encouraged the artist to retain a Japanese sensibility while also engaging with the national identity of his adopted home. Field also offered compassion and financial support when Kuniyoshi and Schmidt married in 1919. He presided over the ceremony, held in Ogunquit, Maine, and he offered the use of a Brooklyn apartment and a studio in Ogunquit as a wedding present. Schmidt's family opposed her marriage to a Japanese national, and debates about the marriage reverberated throughout the Art Students League. It was a difficult period for the couple, both emotionally and financially. Kuniyoshi's paintings and ink drawings from the early years of this marriage were mostly set in Maine, incorporating details from daily life at Field's compound in Perkins Cove. His works often included an aerial perspective and alluded to childhood dreams, memories, and nightmares. Many of these works were produced in a distinctive pen, brush, and ink style, which integrated traditional Japanese drawing techniques with a modernist American eye. Reflecting a Japanese approach, Kuniyoshi's drawings were self-contained statements and not preparatory sketches for future paintings. These drawings are inventive, while alluding to Japanese artistic precedents as if reaching through a thick fog of personal memory. His application of rich black inks evokes traditional sumi techniques, and with their purity, calligraphy, and velvety richness, Kuniyoshi's ink drawings harness the limitations of their medium to dazzling effect. Kuniyoshi's ability to convey emotion with limited means is well demonstrated in Boy Frightened by Lightning. The drawing depicts a young boy sitting on a hillside near a house, crouching in fear. His toes curl anxiously upon the bare ground, and he plugs his ears with his long fingers, trying to quiet the roar of the furious skies above, cracking with electric strikes of lightning. The tilted planes of the house, combined with its wind-blown curtains, heighten the sense of vulnerability. The architecture suggests that of Perkins Cove, where Field owned a group of fishermen's cottages, seen here on the right in the background of a contemporary photograph of Kuniyoshi and Schmidt with friends. Kuniyoshi and his wife summered in one of these cottages, and the local landscape, with its vernacular architecture, influenced his development of a new graphic style. In Boy Frightened by Lightning, the geometric structures appear as sharply rectilinear forms, seemingly jostled together by the pure force of the lightning strikes. The representation of the architecture and its steeply tilted view and young protagonist also recall the work of Marc Chagall, which Kuniyoshi knew and admired through reproductions. Kuniyoshi's distinctive vision of childhood emotions with imaginative symbolism are especially apparent in a series that he made on the theme of fear. As Kuniyoshi scholar Tom Wolfe explains, it is very unusual for an artist to make the emotion of fear a work's primary subject, yet Kuniyoshi did so repeatedly. These works examine the vulnerability of young people placed in uncharted and potentially threatening situations. Scholars have connected these invisible threats to Kuniyoshi's own anxieties regarding his immigration status, which he could safely explore in the highly symbolic works he created prior to the enactment of the Racist Asian Exclusion Act of 1924. With its technical inventiveness and unnerving subject, Boy Frightened by Lightning encapsulates Kuniyoshi's anxieties. As a synthesis of Japanese visual traditions and the New England setting made available to him by his American patron, this drawing expresses Kuniyoshi's artistic consciousness at a specific moment of great personal difficulty. To conclude this whirlwind highlights tour of the book and exhibition, the final work I would like to share with you today is Georgia O'Keeffe's The Patio No. 1, a painting that confirms the artist's devotion to this desert landscape that had cast an enduring spell upon her. O'Keeffe was first enthralled by the New Mexico landscape in 1917, when she was struck by the dramatic colors of the red mesas and the textures of the green sagebrush strewn across the desert. In 1929, she returned to New Mexico at the invitation of Mabel Dodge Lewin, who offered her use of a studio at her Taos property. In August 1934, O'Keeffe made her first visit to Ghost Ranch, located an hour north of Santa Fe in the Chama River Valley. She drove her Ford Model A through the desert, seeking out the place that she'd heard described as the most beautiful in the world. The ranch made an immediate impression on O'Keeffe, who had already been dreaming of living in the New Mexico desert. In 1936, O'Keeffe spent her first summer living in the Rancho de los Burros house, a modest adobe structure angled toward the southern horizon and the flat-top mesa. For O'Keeffe, this house served as a place of refuge and sanctuary. She found peaceful isolation in the U-shaped structure surrounded by open skies and views of the Jemez Mountains. In the evenings, she frequently climbed a pine ladder to the roof where she could watch the stars, survey the mountains in the moonlight, and sleep under the cool desert air. In 1940, O'Keeffe purchased the adobe house and 8 surrounding acres of land. The house at Ghost Ranch was the first property she had ever owned, fulfilling a long-held dream. The Patio No. 1 is the first painting in a series of views of the house and courtyard. The asymmetrical view of the patio is tightly framed, with a door and a chimney cropped by the composition. The vigas, or the large timbers that support the roof, cast long shadows on the exterior walls, creating a second, subtler geometric pattern. The low-slung, whitewashed adobe wall is framed by 2 parallel bands of color. Along the top and bottom of the composition, there's the dazzling blue New Mexico sky above and the wild green sagebrush below. O'Keeffe's close cropping, coupled with the reflection in the window, conveys the artist's familiarity with the visual language of modernist photography. The patio is painted like a snapshot, with the left side of the composition abruptly cut away, like almost offering a disruption common in photography, but less common in oils. A series of casual photographs of O'Keeffe, taken by her close friend Maria Chabot, offer an engaging contrast to the artist's carefully composed views of the house. Unlike the whitewashed walls of the interior courtyard, the roof retained the unpainted colors of sand and clay. And this composition makes apparent O'Keeffe's interest in these natural building forms. Through color, shape, and contrast, the roof is marked as a site of particular importance, a suggestion also made by related contemporary drawing. Visitors to O'Keeffe's home were invited to join her on the roof at night to watch the sky and observe the moon and the blackness of mountain silhouettes. The Patio No. 1 suggests just how much the flat roof formed an essential part of O'Keeffe's living space. Although the depiction of her patio does not explicitly make the roof its central subject, the radiant blue of the sky shines down upon it like a bright benediction, imbuing this beloved place with particular significance. This was the place where she could lie on her back, resting upon her home, and watch the sky as her spirit engaged with the stars. Thank you for joining me today. These stories are just a few highlights from my new book, American Beauty, the Osher Collection of American Art, now available in the museum's stores. The book features an individual essay for each of the works in the promised Osher Collection gift, and each entry is brought to life with generous comparative illustrations and beautiful new photography. With that, I will thank you for joining me today, and I will open it up for a couple questions now, and then I will make myself available in the hall outside as we prepare for Jeff Rosenheim's lecture about Irving Penn. Thank you. Thank you. Are there any questions? Oh, yes.
Strikes me that when you're looking at all the different art schools in Europe, the majority of the artists are women. What happened to them?
That's a great question. I'm showing my bias with the illustrations I chose to put on screen today. There were certainly more men than women in these schools, but there's an incredible number of American women who went abroad and studied and came back, and some had success in the United States, but the artistic freedom experienced by women in the U.S., I don't think measured against what was then available in Europe. But there is an entirely alternative history of American art that can be written about those women and their role. There's also a lot to be said for some of the artists in the collection who taught women. I didn't really speak that much about Robert Henry, but he was an incredible egalitarian teacher who believed that everyone had a right to an art education if they wanted one. And we could talk more about that in relation to another painting that's on view upstairs. Sorry, that was a roundabout answer.
Lauren, I hope you don't mind, but this is a question for Mr. and Mrs. Osher.
No, I don't mind.
How they chose to collect what they collected. Thank you.
A question for the Oshers about their collecting, if they'd like to speak.
How come you collected what you collected? How come you collected what you have been collecting?
Well, I was always interested in art. When I went to college, I studied American art as well as European art, but concentrated on American things. I never thought in a million years that I'd have money enough to buy these pictures, really and truly. But after being out of college and getting into business after about 20 years, I had the opportunity to start buying pictures, and I actually knew what I wanted to buy. And as you can see, I put together not a bad collection over those years of the artists that I really liked. And I think the people here have done a fantastic job making a catalog and showing it as they do. So thank you very much.
You know, it's not only Mr. Osher. I found a few pieces that I said, we have to buy those. And one of them I would like to point out is this fantastic painting by Blum of his fellow artist, I think, Ferdinand Landgren, who happened to be a Swede, but I felt he looked like Edvard Munch. And that's why I urged Barney to buy that painting. But it's not Edvard Munch, although he looks alike.
And I'm sorry, I don't have an image of that portrait, but it's in Gallery 28 upstairs. Okay, well, I think we should close out there. How do we top Bernard and Barbro Osher? Thank you for being here today, and I'll be in the hallway to speak to more of you. Thank you.